Welcome to OnScript's Biblical World, a podcast exploring the history, archaeology, geography, and cultures of the Bible. Visit us at onscript.study/biblical world.
Hey, Biblical World listeners, this is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we've got a cross-listed episode with OnScript and Biblical World podcasts, and I'm speaking with Kyle Keimer about his work on the Assyrian invasion of Judah and Hezekiah's preparations for it. Really fascinating subject to me, and so I was really privileged to sit down with a Biblical World co-host, Kyle Keimer, to talk about his dissertation research on this subject. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks so much to our producers on the podcast, to Jason Stark, who produced this episode, and also to Taylor Terzic, who produces for us as well. So thanks so much for listening, and if you'd like to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, we would be very grateful. Hey, Biblical World listeners, this is Matt Lynch here with Biblical World co-host Kyle Keimer. Kyle, how you doing?
I am pretty good today. How you doing?
I'm doing A-okay. Kyle is, for those of you who don't know him properly, he's Senior Research Fellow in the Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie University, where he was Senior Lecturer in Archaeology, History, and Language of Ancient Israel. For over 20 years, he excavated in Israel and Cyprus, and he was the co-director of the Khirbet el-Rai excavations. I guess you're technically still co-director, and in terms of getting those publications out and the feature-length film related to those sites, I'm sure, right?
Yes. It's going to be a blockbuster.
Yeah. Okay. Daily life in Khirbet el-Rai, I think will draw the crowds.
I would count on dozens of people to watch that.
Literally dozens. And he's an author of various articles, and editor, co-editor of books as well, including Registers and Modes of Communication in the Ancient Near East, and the Ancient Israelite World, which is a recent, that just came out this year, I believe.
Yeah, earlier this
Routledge.
year.
Yep. And he wrote his dissertation at UCLA on the socioeconomic impact of Hezekiah's preparations for rebellion. And this conversation actually came out of an email I sent to Chris and Kyle, and I asked, I hadn't remembered that this was the name of your dissertation, and I was like, hey, what do we know about like the socioeconomic status of 8th century Judah? And you're like, well, and then you sent back the dissertation, which was precisely on that subject. So I'm really glad to speak with you about this, Kyle.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, so I want to actually just get into your background a little bit and hear what drew you into archaeology and biblical geography as well. Initially, what were some of the draws that brought you into those fields?
Well, for archaeology, I mean, I think growing up in the 80s, Indiana Jones obviously was one of the big things. I watched those and said, wow, I want to do that. I want to whip things, blow things up. I mean, that's just what archaeology is. So Sign me up. No, well, it was always an interest, but then I was also really fascinated always with the Bible as well. The Old Testament was so foreign, and so combine Indiana Jones, which is dealing with some biblical themes anyway, with the actual Bible itself, and you got a recipe. And then I went to college, started in physics. Turns out I can't do math though, so you kind of need to do some math to do physics. And said, well, I want to do something that doesn't require hardly any math. Let's go do a dig in Israel. And I loved it. And that was the beginning. And then as I went to Israel, I was just so fascinated by seeing the actual remains. And I had opportunities then as I went into grad school to go over there repeatedly, and actually worked with a company called Biblical Backgrounds for a while. And we did a kind of company tour where we just went around all of Israel and all of Jordan for a month straight, visiting as many sites, as many regions as possible, and just fell in love with the land. And that has stuck with me. And it's really been such an important part of my own scholarship and understanding of the biblical text, the biblical story, both from a personal and an academic level, of how things kind of come together and what holds all of that together. And that is the land itself.
Yeah. Reading your dissertation, it's clear that you have both the sort of deep experience of archaeology at specific sites, but also the lay of the land in general. And I could see how both of those things of going around to all the sites in 1 month as well as excavating at one particular place over a long period of time pay off.
Yeah. And every summer I would go over there, I just rent a car and every weekend go off and explore new sites and say, well, I haven't been to this place. Let's go do it. And if people came with me, great. Otherwise, I just go off and explore myself and see these things and kind of build this impression of all the different regions of the land and what it was like.
And when you pull up to a site, let's say you're renting a car and you go to a site, what are you doing when you go there?
I generally like to look and get a sense of the lay of the land, where the site is, what its kind of topic or geographical feeling is in that broader region. Then look at the specific archaeological remains, if there are any as well. And then I typically have a map in hand, a nice biblical backgrounds map. And so I can situate myself in three-dimensional space. And then I start to piece together the history. Okay, well, what took place at this site, or what took place in this region? What are the themes that we see going on here? Do we see similar themes across history that might be tied to the geographic reality of this location or this site? And so for me, it's working through multiple levels, from the very specific to the broadly regional to the kind of synthesis of everything, including the text.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your acknowledgments the influence of James Monson on you. I guess he's the son of John Monson. Do I have it the right way around?
Other way around.
There?
So
other way around.
Jim,
okay.
Yeah, Jim is the dad and John is the son.
John's the son. Okay. So explain the impact of both of them on you and the discipline of biblical geography.
Yeah, so John was one of my professors at Wheaton College when I was doing my master's, and he was the one who really introduced me to the land. And their background is that Jim was the president of JUC, Jerusalem University College, in Jerusalem on Mount Zion for 30 years or so. And so John grew up over there. And so these two individuals probably know the land of Israel better than anyone else. I would say better than most Israelis, actually, because they were constantly out leading field trips, exploring the land, pulling everything together, and they passed that on to their students, and I was the benefit of that. And so when I had the opportunity then to start working with Jim, I jumped at that, and it just steamrolled from there.
Yeah. So your dissertation is on the socioeconomic impact of Hezekiah's preparations for rebellion. So help us locate Hezekiah historically, and what are the geopolitical kind of dynamics during his reign that are so significant?
Yeah, so we're looking at the end of the 8th century. And of course, there's a debate about when precisely Hezekiah reigns. You've got two options, really, from about 727 to 698, or 715 to 687, if I remember correctly. I think most scholars probably tend to go with the latter option at this point. But regardless, we're looking at the end of the 8th century, and bigger picture, what we're looking at is this is the real arrival of Assyria. So, Assyria's been around. They had already made their entree in the 9th century before kind of falling apart, but they've come back again in the days of Tiglath-Pileser III. So we're looking, 745 to 727 or so. So they come in and they've already decimated several of the Levantine kingdoms down through Damascus, and starting to chip away at the northern kingdom of Israel, along with the Philistine kingdoms to the west of Judah. So Judah is in a place where, you're as a king, you're thinking, okay, what is my next play going to be? Assyria's coming. Really, there's nothing that's going to stop them. I mean, there are various coalitions that were formed that tried, and to a certain degree were successful sometimes, but the writing's on the wall. And how are you going to respond to that? Are you going to eventually try to resist them, or are you going to just give in with the potential realization that either they might kill you or at least ship you off to another part of the country as part of their deportation process? And so you've got a really difficult situation then as a king. And this is what faces Ahaz and what faces Hezekiah in particular, as we know from the biblical text. Ahaz opts to, pay off and bring the Assyrians closer to solve a local problem. Hezekiah then, takes an about face, basically.
Yeah. So why are the Assyrians, why do they care about this area? Like, what's the big deal with Israel and Judah?
Well, I don't really think they care about Judah at all. I think that they care about Israel just because it's in the way of getting to Egypt. And I think if we look at the way Assyria expands and what they're after, which is on the one hand, an ideological realm or an ideological perspective of we're expanding the piece of Asher and we want to take over. But in a more realistic realm, it's we want to take access to all the trade routes and get all the goods that are flowing around the Near East in this first millennium. And there's a lot. Now, Israel sits right on the main international north-south route and some of the east-west international trade that links Arabia with the Mediterranean. So it's kind of a no-brainer that Assyria would be interested to take over that region. Judah, however, is up in the mountains for the most part, and unless they expand westward into the south, they're not really tapping into this international trade. So, for the Assyrians, Judah doesn't matter so much unless they try and get in the way. And I think that's what takes place in the days of Hezekiah, is he sees an opportunity to expand and to kind of grow his own little local kingdom, but then that ultimately brings him into greater conflict with the Assyrians.
And that expansion that you talk about is the expansion westward into Philistia, right?
Right, to the west and to a certain degree to the south as well. Now,
into the Negev.
Into the Negev, yeah. And Judah already had a presence in the Negev, I would argue, going back to the 10th century. And they've maintained that presence. And that is where all the incense trade and trade from Southeast Asia is coming. So it's really lucrative to control that area. You at the same time, though, you do have local power starting to rise, and there's a greater interest then on the Assyrians' part to control the outlet of this long distance trade, which is really the region of Gaza, where everything kind of comes together. And so for the Assyrians, if they can control all of Philistia, that's like a double whammy. They get the north-south and the east-west trade, as long as nobody, again, is infringing upon that. And it puts them on the doorstep of Egypt, which is really where they want to go, because then that opens up a whole nother realm of access to precious stones, minerals, gold, things like that.
Tourists wanting to see the pyramids.
Exactly. And there's an inscription from Shalmaneser that says, "I just love the pyramids. I can't wait to see them."
Yeah, exactly. That the Israelites built, as we know, as well.
Of course.
Right. So you talked about Gaza, toward the coast there. Is that, are we talking about like shipping trade as well during this time? Or is it kind of too early for serious shipping trade happening? Are they just kind of like floating boats up the coast, or are they doing like hardcore Mediterranean trade?
Yeah, I would say they're definitely doing some hardcore Mediterranean trade at this point. Mostly at the helms of the Phoenicians. So they're the ones that are doing all this, and so this is why they always seem to get better deals than many of the people that deal with the Assyrians, is because I think the Assyrians recognize the Phoenicians have this specialized knowledge of seafaring that is going to benefit them. So they give them a little bit more leeway, not necessarily free reign or anything, but so there is that aspect of it. But if you can control the land routes, then you kind of cut out the middleman. You don't have to deal with the Phoenicians per se. You can just tap right into direct control of these routes.
Yeah. And are there ports, serious ports further south, or is it primarily up in like the Tyre region? Where are the sort of Mediterranean routes coming through?
Yeah, you've got a couple that are further to the south. So Ashkelon potentially was a major port. There is Ashdod Yam, which is like the sea port area of Ashdod. The extent of that, though, isn't exactly clear in the Iron Age, I would say. Gaza potentially also had a sea kind of harbor area, but we know absolutely nothing really about archaeology of Gaza.
Can't just go digging there.
No, not so much. And then there's a couple sites further to the south, actually along kind of closer to the Wadi al-Arish that is in Egypt today. And we have references in Assyrian sources to the Karu. These are like the trading depots that would have controlled land trade, but potentially some of the sites that are located south of Gaza are right along the Mediterranean coast. So they might have also tapped into some of the sea trade.
So, and I'm asking all this to just think about so Judah, according to what you've described there, is going to be economically poorer, but strategically, militarily more protected, being up in the mountains, right?
Yes, and to a certain degree. I think that they're still tapping into some of the trade coming through the Negev, because for all intents and purposes, we know they've got Arad, Beersheba, several other sites, some other fortresses down in the Arava and further south that would allow them to, get a piece of that trade coming through. But how much north-south trade they're getting, that's probably a lot less, because the Philistines are their own entity to the west, and Judah doesn't really have great access that direction. So they're getting maybe a portion of the pie, but not as much as, say Assyria wants, that's for sure.
Right. What about like copper and other, like that sort of trade? Are they involved in that, do you think?
In this part of the Iron Age in the 8th century, the copper, as far as I know, has shifted back to Cyprus. So the mines at Timna and Fainan, which were the mines in the early Iron Age, 11th through 9th centuries in particular, seem to have really gone out of use. And the main copper in the later part of the Iron Age is coming back from Cyprus, which is where it had come in the Bronze Age as well. So Judah isn't really on the line to tap into that kind of trade so much. But again, the spice trade that's coming through the Negev would have been something they could have been a part of. The trade in fabrics probably also as well. Other than that, they don't have anything that really stands out and makes the Assyrians go, ooh, I want to go there and get that. I mean, grain, ooh, grain. Well, we can go that. Wine, maybe there's some really good, 730 BC, vintage, Pinot Noir that they love. So,
yeah. Okay. Now it's helpful to get that sort of economic picture, because that's a big part of what you're analyzing. But as Hezekiah is moving westward and southward, he's now stepping on the Assyrians' toes. And tell me about the sort of strategic gamble he's making specifically in 705 BC.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things we see in the ancient Near East is that when a king of a powerful country or kingdom dies, this is the moment that the people that have been subjected to them kind of rise up and say, aha, here's our chance to see if we can throw off their yoke. And I mean, you could find any number of these kind of references throughout different Assyrian annals, other annals as well. And this is what happens in 705. So Sargon the second is killed in battle. The Assyrians kind of go into a kind of challenging situation. Sennacherib basically has to deal with revolts in Babylon and further to the east as well. And then he also has to come to the west and deal with rebellious kingdoms in the northern Levant, the southern Levant, if he wants to maintain his kingdom. And so over a period of his, the first 3 years of his reign, this is exactly what he does. He just basically is constantly fighting wars to try and reclaim the territory and say, guess what, guys? I'm still pretty powerful and strong, just like Sargon and my dad, and I'm going to continue to reign here. So get in line. And I think this is the context here for Hezekiah, is that number one, they're on the fringes of the Assyrian Empire. They certainly, I think, have a knowledge of what's going on in the world. I mean, none of these smaller kingdoms live in a vacuum, and so to think that Hezekiah wouldn't have known that there were rebellions happening elsewhere, that Assyria might be in a state of disarray, is, I would say, just wrong. I mean, I think clearly they have this understanding. And so you're presented with an opportunity then to say, okay, we can now test the Assyrians and see if they're going to come back, if they're really here to stay, if they're going to be powerful enough to stop us. Oh, and by the way, the Philistines don't like them. The Egyptians don't like them. Let's just kind of all get together. I mean, we're in the majority here, and we know from past times that coalitions can actually stop them. So, hey, what's there to lose? I mean, you could die, obviously, but what's there to lose, really?
So he's not just throwing off the Assyrian yoke on his own. They're banding together. He's joining with the Philistines, or like who's he joining? So you mentioned the Egyptians as well,
right? It seems I mean, this is kind of how we have to reconstruct from references in the biblical text and from some extra biblical sources as well, is that the Egyptians clearly are not fans of the Assyrians, and they seem to join up with the Judahites as a way to stop the Philistines as well. As we know, both from Assyrian sources and the biblical text, they also most of them weren't pro-Assyrian. And we read about different intrigues where the Assyrians come and try and put a pro-Assyrian king in Ashdod or Ashkelon. And then Hezekiah comes and the Philistines rebel and they kick out that pro-Assyrian king and put a pro-Judahite king, or an anti-Assyrian king at the least. And so this coalition is forming then through these different intrigues. Again, whether that's to control the access to all the trade, or it's just to drive Assyria out. I mean, it's all kind of related.
And so at this time, Hezekiah is sort of the senior negotiating partner relative to Philistia, at least, as he's also encroaching on their territory.
Yeah, and the reason why I think this is, and I think that's a really good way to say it, is because Judah has had the benefit, as you mentioned earlier, of kind of being up in the mountains. And so for the last 300 years or so, they really haven't had anyone invade their territory and disrupt their economy. And even before that, right? I mean, you can go back. You've got, a couple campaigns by the Northern Kingdom of Israel that challenged Judah, or maybe they influenced Judah for a very short period of time, maybe a couple Edomite incursions, but these are all fairly limited in scope. And so the Judahite economy is probably stronger than any other economy in that region, because the Philistines, number one, they're smaller territories, smaller entities, but they've also been attacked already and sacked a couple times by Assyrian kings. To the south, there's no really coherent political entity that controls or has settlements of the scale that you find in the Shephelah or in Judah. I mean, you've got either Arabian tribes trading through there, or you've got Edomites as well. But again, it's of a different scale, if you will. And so Judah really is unique in this regard, in that here's an infrastructure that hasn't been challenged and probably is fairly strong at this time because of the lack of interruption, but also because Ahaz, right, Hezekiah's dad, paid the Assyrians off and becomes a kind of pro-Assyrian vassal right from the get-go. So there's no reason for the Assyrians to come in and impose any of their policies per se on them, aside from tribute, which we have a couple Assyrian sources that mention the Judahite tribute from the days of Tiglath-Pileser or Sargon II.
So Hezekiah, he's making this gamble. Sargon has died. Sargon II has died. And he revolts, joins this coalition, or helps form one. And he also then makes a sort of network of strategic defenses, or at least beefs them up during this time. This is a big part of your work. So talk about like what sorts of preparation he's making in the event that Assyria gets mad, which of course they will, and attacks. And what's the evidence of those defenses?
Well, let me give a little background, because the I guess rationale and thinking about like a defensive network for Judah is something that I came to in reading about classical civilizations, a lot of Greek literature dealing with the different city-states and defensive networks that you find around them, and just having a broader interest in warfare and the way that impacts all aspects of society, if you will. And so these interests are what led me to kind of start thinking about, well, did Judah have its own kind of coherent defensive network? And so I started to look at, well, where are the sites located? Where do we have fortifications? And what might be the strategic rationale for any of these given sites? And gradually, I would say it came in, at least in my mind, it came into final resolution that, yeah, there was actually a coherent defensive network, because sites are located sometimes away from any trade routes or any natural resources. Why are they there? But when you look at them, they have this amazing strategic perspective that allows for communication or relaying of information. And it's the confluence then of the geography tied to military concerns, as we know from kind of the broader military history of the world, that kind of gave me the framework for looking at the archaeology through fresh eyes, if you will. And one of the things we see is not only that many of the sites are located outside of what we might expect if it's just natural population growth, or they're trying to access resources, but also the number of these sites increases, and they vary kind of from region to region in Judah. So the types of sites, the distribution of sites that we find in the Shephelah looks very different from what we find in the Negev, looks very different from what we find in the wilderness, looks very different from what we find in the Central Benjamin Plateau. But there was always an underlying logic to the distribution of those sites that, at least in my mind, is tied to a strategic element for military purposes.
All right, so you've got this concept of a strategic network of defense, because you want a coherent strategy if you're going to put up a legitimate effort against the Assyrians. This is no small, weak opponent. The most powerful kingdom in the known world at the time. So tell me about what qualifies something as a strategic defense. What are some of the factors at play, and where are the most vulnerable places for Hezekiah as he's looking at the entirety of Judea?
I think we need to step back and ask an even more fundamental question, and that is, if you're going to rebel against Assyria, what do you need if you think you're going to be successful? And the number one answer, at least in my mind, is you need supplies, you need food, because even if you're going to face them in open field battle, you need to marshal an army, you need to feed them, right? Everything kind of hinges on people being able to eat food and not starve. If you're going to kind of deal with Assyria by sieges of attrition, well, you're going to need even more food. So where do you grow this food? How do you grow it to keep it safe from potential Assyrian interaction, or even the robbing of other nations around you? And how long does it take to actually prepare food and stockpile it in a meaningful way that isn't going to be gone in one summer or one winter? And so, I started thinking about this. And again, there's a lot, there's not a lot, there's some written about this again in classical sources that got me thinking along these lines. And when I started to factor in, I think, this very real question, it allowed me again to look at the archaeology and the distribution of the sites even more meaningfully, because again, you have many sites that just aren't on agricultural land or on agriculturally productive land. So why are they there? Again, would give me an impetus to think that they're probably tied to some strategic function that would require or would be connected to observation or the passing of information via smoke signals, which is something we know they did in the ancient Near East already from the Old Babylonian period in Mari. And when we then also look at the Lamelic system, which is something I know we'll talk about here in a second, we have these 4 place names that show up in these inscriptions that scholars haven't always agreed on what they represent or where they're located, but I would argue are actually the centers of the 4 most agriculturally productive regions in Judah that are also well geared for producing agriculture and safe from enemy invasion, as safe as they can be. So it's not that they're on the fringes of the kingdom. They're not in valleys that are open to invasion per se. They're in more guarded regions of the kingdom. And if we allow for this and say that this is the case, again, the settlement pattern that we find starts to come into greater view, because you're going to find larger cities in the Shrela where you have these, but these are a different pattern than these Lamelic jars, which seem to be of an administrative structure. So there's the multiple systems taking place or operating at the same time, none of which I think operate individually, but none of them are kind of clear if we only view them in and of themselves.
Right. So that's what I love about what you were doing in your dissertation is kind of bringing all those components together and thinking about, okay, to mount a meaningful defense, you need economic strength and military strength. You need both of those things. And so where's the economic strength going to come from? Of course, it's going to be the land. How does that function? So you mentioned the Lamelic seal impressions. Talk about what those are. So Lamelic belonging to the king or for the king. And this shows up on a number of clay jar handles. And why are people concerned about these? And how do you think they're operating? What does that tell us about Hezekiah?
Yeah. Oh, such a series of easy questions you throw out there. Let's see, the Lamelic jars. So these are, as you mentioned, they mean, Lamelic just means belonging to the king or of the king. And so it's generally understood by scholars that these are royal jars. That is, they're store jars that are holding supplies for the use by the royal household, whether that's through direct use by the household or through extension through the administration, and probably more so the broader administration, because we've got something like upwards of 2,000 preserved jar handles. The number of actual restorable jars is far less than that, but we can know based on the number of handles that the actual number of jars was far larger than we even see in the archaeological record. The fact that we have such a large number of these and they're spread out throughout Judah, something like, I forget, at this point, we're probably up to 80 or 90 sites have lamellic jars present at them and can roughly be dated to the late 8th century. There's a caveat, and I'll get to that in a second because it's about the dating of these. But traditionally, they were understood to be, initially they were understood to date to the days of Josiah. And that was based on the interpretation of the stratigraphy at Lachish, where they were discovered in troves. However, when Usishkin from Tel Aviv went back and re-excavated Lachish and had a better understanding of the stratigraphy, he realized that no, they actually all date to stratum 3, and that's the stratum that is destroyed by Sennacherib in 701 BC. So now we have this archaeological peg for dating these lamellic jars and this whole phenomenon, and it puts us right in the reign of Hezekiah. And so in Hezekiah's day, in the late 8th century, it seems you have this system of administrative store jars that are pervasive throughout the country that we don't see before, and we hadn't seen really after that time as well, because the number of lamellic jars that we find in strata subsequent to the Assyrian destruction layers, really you have either different types of store jars or hardly any of the lamellic jars at all. So it seemed to have been a very short phenomenon that could be anchored to the very end of the 8th century BC. There's been recent work in the last probably 10, 15 years, particularly by Oded Lipschitz and a couple of his students, that have called some of this into question and said, actually, the lamellic store jars are part of a longer phenomenon that actually continues in various forms, even into the Hellenistic period. And I think he makes a really good case for the continuity of some of this administration going forward, even though there are some of the specifics that we would disagree on. But these jars, what are they representing? Well, that's a question in and of itself. What are the 4 place names that we have there? And there's been any number of different theories about that, going all the way back to Albright's day and 100 years ago, as to what are these 4 place names, and are they royal estates? Are they wineries? Are they something else? And even today, there's hardly any consensus about most aspects of the lamellic system, even though it's the most extensive ceramic corpus I think we have in Judah.
Yeah, and so your case though is that these jar handles, which show up at 90 different sites, only have 4 place names on them, and those 4 place names represent the main agricultural growing regions from which the food stores the wine or whatever is being sourced, right? And then distributed.
Right. Yeah. So that's so when I added the layer of the geography to the considerations of these 4 place names, which really hadn't been done before I did it, it's Soko, it's Hebron, it's a place called Memeshet, or however you want to say it, and Ziph. So where are these located? Well, none of them are in the Shvelah, right? They're all up in the hill country. And why is Hebron and why are Ziph 2 places? I mean, they're only separated by something like 12 kilometers. Why so close if you're going to have this kind of evenly distributed system? Well, again, the region of Ziph and the region of Hebron are both extremely agriculturally productive. The region of Soko as well. I'm sorry, I misspoke just a second ago. Soko, I would identify as a Soko in the Shvelah in the Elah Valley, which is probably the easiest of the western Shvelah valleys to defend, because you have the Azekah Ridge that basically forms like a giant wall that limits invasion from that direction. Then the question is this Memeshet. And a lot of research has been done that would I would say tie it to the region of Ramat Rahel, just south of Jerusalem. So the Bethlehem region, basically, which if you've been there, even today, it's a breadbasket. Wheat can grow everywhere. And so these 4 regions, all of a sudden is like, these are agricultural heartlands right here. And so whether you're growing wheat or grapes or olives, right? We don't necessarily know what was stored in these jars. Nobody's really done a residue analysis of them. Everyone just assumes that it's wine or oil, but that's never been proved. It probably could have been grain as well, because we know they stored grain in similar types of jars in other periods as well. These are the regions where you would want a kind of administrative center if you're going to tap into those resources to stockpile them, to prepare them, to then ship them kind of throughout the country as might need be.
Yeah, I'm surprised that there hasn't been residue analysis on these. I don't know all the ins and outs of what that costs, but But it seems like given how pervasive they are, that would have been done.
It might be also that the challenge, sometimes the payoff with residue analysis isn't what you want it to be. Because I think we see these great articles about the really fantastic finds that are possible to identify. But a lot of times you find more mundane things that you can't always parcel out. So you can say, yeah, there was wine in here. But yeah, for whatever reason, I mean, maybe there is a study that I'm not aware of, but last I really kind of looked, there hadn't been one done on the lamellic jars.
Oh, interesting. And so you're not only thinking about the lamellic administrative system of food stores, you're also thinking about what is a location that's a good place to defend. And so what I loved in the maps that you had was all the lines of sight that you showed. So you'd have a place like Ramat Rahel and show what you could see from that location. I hadn't seen that done before. Is that your own innovation?
Yeah, I had been thinking along the line. There's a study in Hebrew. I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name who wrote it, where he tried to do something similar, but it wasn't to the extent that I did, because I think he was looking at the Lachish letters specifically. Now that I think about it for a second, so he was only thinking in the kind of 7th century context. So I said, well, let's see what we can do with an 8th century. And is there, as part of trying to figure out, was there actually a coherent defensive network? And as I started to develop and lay these lines of sight on, you could see that there clearly was. I mean, so the sites that were out in the middle of nowhere and made no sense otherwise were perfect for relaying information. We're like the central hubs of these communication networks. And so all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so it might have been a signal tower plus a little like lookout post or something, and you talk about like cities versus towers versus outposts. So that was helpful too. Yeah. And I had written down like, so a signal from Beit Shemesh, you wrote, a signal would proceed to Zorah, Zanoah, Beit Itab, Khirbet el Abhar, and Rum el Barish. So like the process by which a signal will get to Jerusalem is something you also worked out. Like, okay, where's this going to have to go to reach Jerusalem, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Very Lord of the Rings-esque if you think of the Return of the King at the end where they're lighting that. But again, this is something we know from inscriptions in the Near East that they were doing. This is how you communicate over a broader space. And so we have the reference in the Lachish letters that's, they're sending smoke signals, fire signals. So
yeah, stands to reason. That leads me to I have just a couple off the beaten path questions for you. And one of them is, do you think generally about approaches and strategic defenses wherever you are? Like some people that they'll go into a room and like think about how they could get out and that sort of thing. So when you go outside, are you thinking like, okay, how would you defend this location? Where would an army approach? Is this stuff you think about in general?
Every now and then, yes, I do. But in general, not usually, but sometimes, yes.
Yeah, like when you go over to friends' houses, you're not like, this place is very vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm like, you need to build a defense network in your backyard and put some traps in the front too to keep the cats away.
Exactly.
Which, speaking, I've got too many stray cats that wander around my house that I should build a defensive network.
Yeah, exactly. So you probably don't have a huge rat problem then.
No, we don't, fortunately. Yeah, that's a positive. I hadn't thought of that.
But your birds probably don't like it.
No, they don't.
Have you ever seen stats on how many birds a year that house cats and feral cats kill?
It's a ton. My father-in-law always tells me this because he's a big bird guy, and so
it is like in the billions.
Yeah.
How many? I mean, people talk about like the windmills and how many they kill. It's like in the tens of thousands or something. But it's house cats. They're the problem. Yeah. Okay. What site has been most significant for you in thinking about strategic defense? Like, was there a site where it kind of clicked for you?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. As I was going through, I think I just was trying to go through all the excavation materials and survey materials and situate them on really good 3D maps, which is the biblical background maps is what I was working with because they're the only really high quality topographic maps that were available at that point in time. And I still think they're the best that there are right now. I don't know if there's any single site that stuck out. Although when I was looking at the sites in the Judean wilderness and, identifying sites that I argue, there's a high probability that they date to, the days of Hezekiah or in this time period. There's a route from En-Gedi up towards basically the Bethlehem area. And you actually have a limited number of sites along there, all little watchtowers. But if you calculate out the view shed, basically you can create a continuous line of communication from the Dead Sea all the way up into the Bethlehem region. So I thought that was pretty cool as I was piecing it together. Like, okay.
You can see that from here, that from here. Right. Mm-hmm. What's the most significant book in archaeology in the last 50 years?
Oh gosh, probably the Ancient Israelite World that I edited.
Just look at that. That's pretty cool that you got to work on it. The most significant book. Okay, good.
Oh gosh, most significant book in archaeology. That's I would have to probably say it might be David Schlon's book, The House of the Father, where he details
as fact and symbol.
Yeah, where he really lays out a really sociologically informed understanding of how we look at the ancient Near East and how things operated back then. And he uses not only the texts, but the archaeology and brings them together in the framework of a really well-informed kind of theoretical and developed methodological approach. And so I really appreciated that. And I think I've, to a certain degree, tried to replicate that because I think we need to work with both corpora, the text, and the archaeology in a way to kind of bring them together to see what they can help us to see better.
Another question. Chris McKinney is wrong about what?
What isn't he wrong about?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, where do you start?
Let's see. Khirbet el-Rai. I'm sorry, the place of Ziklag. He mistakenly thinks that it's Tel Sharia.
Oh my goodness.
And probably, I'm guessing 99.9% of our listeners would agree that it's at Khirbet el-Rai. I don't want to overestimate, but that's just a guess.
Okay, good. We won't give him a chance to respond. I think that settles that. And most significant personal find at an archaeological site, like that you dug up.
That I literally dug up with my own hands.
Yeah. Besides the almost library at Hatzor that I heard about in the previous episode.
That would have been pretty
Turned
good.
out to be soap.
Yeah. Soap is nice, but, I'd have to say it's probably a tie. No, I excavated a completely intact store jar from Khirbet Qeiyafa, so dating to the late 11th century, early 10th century. And, when I say completely intact, it wasn't restorable. It was completely intact aside from one little chip off the rim.
No way.
And you generally, don't find them so well preserved. And, it was such an important find, or such a unique find, I should say, that I was tasked with carrying it around to show visitors whenever they came. And so I jokingly thought about getting one of those little baby carriers to plop it in and carry it and, to keep it safe, of course, and give it drinks if it needed something, if it was thirsty. But it was, the fact that it was this completely intact store jar was really cool. I just have to say.
Yeah. It'd be fun to get a replica too. And then go show someone and talk about how significant it is and then sort of trip over someone's foot and drop it. Yeah. Going back to your project, one of the questions that had driven my interest in this initially was like, what can we say about wealth disparity at this time? So you mentioned David Shlomo's book, and one of the things that surprised me was that the percentage of nuclear family homes at this time, in my mind, I had it that most Israelites lived in extended family houses. And I can't remember the exact time period, but the statistic was 3/4 being nuclear family homes and only 1/4 or a third, I forget what it was, being an extended family household. So, all right, so you've got that factor, but what else can you say about wealth stratification and so on?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's a really good one to just draw out for a second too, because you have a site like Beersheba Stratum 3 in particular, this entirely pre-planned city, if you will, sorry, stratum 3, 2.
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's pre-planned, and they're
I think all our listeners know that.
I just want to make sure. But it's all basically 3-room houses aside from a couple bigger ones where probably an administrator or lived or something else. And you find the same thing at other sites. And so there's clearly the shift in the social structure. You see that mirrored in the distribution of ceramic forms as well. The types of vessels that you find and the frequency of them changes as you move into, say, the late 8th century, particularly, let's say, the Lachish Stratum 3 ceramic horizon. You have a lot more storage large bowls and plates. So it seems that as opposed to having maybe more family members that will require more materials, you're looking at actually smaller families that are a bit more discreet. And potentially you're even looking at soldiers who have a limited ration type of food supply. So the whole shift in the ceramic repertoire is really interesting and goes with the change in the architecture that you see at that time period. Now, as far as the actual wealth goes, on the one hand, it's kind of tough to say because I think there's a lot of perishable wealth that just doesn't remain for us to know, particularly if we think about, if Jerusalem had wealth, well, what's been preserved and would it be preserved? The answer to the second question in my mind is no, it wouldn't be preserved. So it's difficult to evaluate how much there actually was there. We have to bring in the text at this point. And here you see, kind of across the board, whether we're talking Isaiah, Micah, Amos, both in the Northern Kingdom, but also in the Southern Kingdom, that there's a social disparity that people are falling through the cracks. And one possible example that ties into this, you have this bowl that was excavated at Beit Shemesh back in the, I forget, 80s or 90s or so. And it mentions basically like my brother. And the interpretation is that possibly this is an offering bowl for people to bring goods into supply, which then can be redistributed to those in need, which is, ties into some of the Deuteronomic laws that we find, in the biblical texts.
Yeah, I thought that bowl was interesting. I actually looked up the image of it. This thing where you potentially, according to Gabby Barkai, give an offering for your brother. And we know Deuteronomy had laws related to sort of quote unquote offerings that didn't go to the temple, but were distributed to people. Yeah, fascinating stuff about the kind of economic situation. Real quick, because we're running short on time, what can we say about Hezekiah's preparations in Jerusalem itself?
Yeah, that's another good question. And I think some of the long-held views have changed a bit, or at least have been questioned in recent years, just because of the kind of ongoing excavations in the city of David and more recent kind of treatments of, say, Hezekiah's tunnel or some of the other aspects of the water system. And I would argue that we've got obviously the broad wall in Jerusalem, which I think is pretty clearly dated to the end of the 8th century. So it should be associated with the wall that is being condemned in Isaiah 21 that Hezekiah is building and tearing down houses to build. So I think that that's probably a pretty good association that we have there.
Come on, Isaiah, give some practical alternatives then. Like you're trying to defend against the Assyrians.
Well, you got Yahweh.
No, but
that's all you need.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, and just for listeners who haven't been there, this broad wall that he's either built or built up around Jerusalem is 25 feet thick. I mean, this thing is a beast, beast of a wall. So yeah, really massive.
Yeah. And the question of, because we have these references in 2 Chronicles 32 of what Hezekiah does, of some of what he does, at least. And it leaves a bit ambiguous. It talks about storehouses and granaries and all these other types of things. And then specifically building the water channel, and which is paralleled to a certain degree in 2 Kings. It talks about Hezekiah building the pool and the aqueduct. Now, unfortunately, these details aren't specific enough to allow us easily to identify features that we find in the archaeology today, because there's several rock cut pools and aqueducts and channels in Jerusalem, not only in the city of David, but also kind of on the western hill to the outside of the Jaffa Gate, or the kind of northwestern corner of the old city of Jerusalem. And so, is something like Hezekiah's pool in the old city, does that actually go back to the first temple period? And is there a pool that would have been connected with an aqueduct? Well, Potentially. And there's remains outside of the old city that have been excavated in the last 10 years or so, that you have some structures that would make us think that perhaps this is the area of, say, the fuller's field where they're bringing water and doing stuff. Again, this is mentioned in Isaiah. But we don't have a smoking gun, so to speak, that says, this is the place for sure. But, there's some.
And has there been rethinking about Hezekiah's tunnel? Like, what's the thinking about that right now?
Yeah, some thinking in some of the more recent ones, and it seems like it changes so often that I don't know if I even know the most recent formulation of it. But it was thought that it was cut in.
It was actually built by Herod the Great.
Yeah. Well, yeah, fortunately, no one has said that, although there were claims that the inscription in Hezekiah's tunnel was Hasmonean or Hellenistic, which was pretty quickly debunked and said that's just not possible. And I would agree with the arguments for that, obviously. But one of the questions is it Hezekiah, what we know today as Hezekiah's tunnel, is that the tunnel is being referred to in the biblical text? Or is it a portion of what we call Channel 2 that's actually what's being referred to? And so Channel 2, if you know, is basically the dry channel. So if you go to Jerusalem today and want to go down to Hezekiah's tunnel, you can either walk through that tunnel and get wet, or you can go through the dry channel, which is the earlier one that runs along the east side of the city of David. So there's thinking that channel was cut in multiple phases, and you can see changes in kind of the direction, but also there's offsets in the stone itself. It's always difficult with these rock cut features, though, to date them and know precisely, because you can't really date it. There's no pottery left per se, or other objects that are easily to identify. There's another idea, though, that I think is really quite interesting, and this is one by a guy named David Gurovich, and he argues that the kind of so-called aqueduct that comes out of the northwestern corner of the temple platform is actually the conduit that the text is referring to, that was cut in the days of Hezekiah. And I really like this idea, and we actually are hoping to bring him on the podcast as well and have him talk about this at some point in time.
Oh, fabulous.
So it's basically, you have this Iron Age aqueduct that was then reused and expanded and cut in the Hellenistic and the Herodian period as well. And so I think there's something really to that, and he can detail all the archaeological aspects that led him to that.
As you step back and think about like what you did in your project on Hezekiah, preparing for the onslaught of the Assyrians, what's like a takeaway that you would want listeners to have in terms of maybe payoff for reading scripture, or about the discipline of archaeology, geography, and text? Like, what's a sort of payoff point that you would want to make?
Yeah, I think the big payoff is that the more at home you are with the geography and with the lay of the land, the more it allows you to read the text through ancient eyes. It allows you to, I think, intuit some of what is being left unsaid, and allows you to really get a better sense of the worldview, because there is a lived experience, a lived landscape that these authors are kind of writing from, and that factor into the way they live life, the way they view things, the way they make their metaphors. And if you don't have that, if you don't have this fundamental understanding of the landscape, you really, you've kind of cut your feet out from underneath of you, at least in my view.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much, Kyle, for being willing to talk about this. And I look forward to learning more from you about the Assyrian period and its implications. But this was a rich study, and I look forward to maybe seeing it in book form someday as well.
We'll see. There's some good updating that needs to be done, but who knows? Maybe it'll happen.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks a lot.
Yep, you're welcome.
You've been listening to OnScript's Biblical World podcast. If you enjoy this show, please show your support by giving us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen. You can support the show by visiting onscript.study/donate. Until next time, keep digging.